What's good?
I'm John.
And I'm Sean.
And this is Crash Course Government and Politics.
Today, we're going to be discussing federalism.
So what is federalism? Federalism is a system of government in which the power is divided between the national and state levels. In American federalism, we have the national government based in Washington, D.C., and state governments in the states. When the federal government wants to put a policy in place to promote the nation's interests, it has a few options. However, when it comes to federalism, the key is Congress. As dictated by the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, laws made by Congress are supreme to state laws and even state constitutions.
When a state and federal government disagree, this makes for interesting situations. I mean, look to any one of the states with legal recreational marijuana. They're directly going against the laws of the federal government, so must skirt the rules a bit to avoid being brought to court. But we'll talk more about that later. Generally, though, the states are forbidden from blatantly ignoring what the federal government says. In Amendment 14, the system of selective incorporation is laid out in which states are forbidden from creating laws that would infringe on the constitutional rights of their citizens.
Though the Constitution does make some wide-brush statements about what the national and state governments can do, it also gives a few specific examples of what powers go to each level. These are referred to as exclusive powers, responsibilities explicitly granted to either the federal government or to the states. The federal government's exclusive powers include that to regulate interstate commerce, enter into treaties, and tax imports, while the states have the sole ability to conduct elections and ratify constitutional amendments.
Outside of exclusive powers are the concurrent powers. Now, these are powers that the federal government and state government share. These include things like the power to tax, the power to borrow money, and the power to establish inferior courts. Once these specific powers have been named and allocated, you are left with a huge mess of smaller powers that aren't really worth spending time on the Constitution itself. To fill in these gaps, the Constitution uses the 10th Amendment, which says that any power not expressly granted to the federal government and not prohibited from the states is left to the states, or alternatively, the people.
This didn't all come to be overnight. During the Revolutionary War, the then colonies saw for the first time the value of having a central government that could coordinate the war effort. The Continental Congress was a product of this, and was the first version of American federalism. Right after the Revolution ended, the country adopted the Articles of Confederation, which gave states almost all of the political power and the national government almost none.
Now this, predictably, did not go well, as the states constantly quarreled and the federal government had absolutely no power to stop them. It became pretty obvious that the country had to replace the Articles. The Constitutional Convention was called, and representatives from all of the states met in Philadelphia to discuss the future of the American government. Supporters of the Constitution devised in this convention were called the Federalists, and their opponents were, naturally, the Anti-Federalists. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, working under the pseudonym Publius, wrote 85 essays in support of the Federalist cause, urging New York State to support and ratify the proposed Constitution. Their message eventually got through, and the Constitution was ratified in June 21st of 1788.
The decentralized confederation established by the Articles was officially replaced by a significantly more united states that came from the Constitution. The aforementioned apportionment of powers that the Constitution laid out continued to evolve over time, as new amendments passed and court cases clarified specific situations. In 1819, the Supreme Court case McCulloch v. Maryland determined that the states could not tax the federal government. Specifically, they could not tax a branch of the national bank. This further entrenched the Supremacy Clause and showed the states that, under the new Constitution, the federal government was the big kid on the block. Just 5 years later, the case of Gibbons v. Ogden granted the federal government some more power as the Commerce Clause was refined and expanded, giving the federal government jurisdiction over a wide definition of interstate commerce.
As the 19th century continued, we saw the Civil War fought and the 13th Amendment ratified, creating a power that neither the states nor the federal government could exercise, allowing slavery. By the late 1870s, a new phase of federalism had begun. A so-called dual federalism involved the state and federal governments working side by side in separate spheres of influence with comparatively little conflict about where those spheres of influence lie. When industrialization took root in American cities, the Interstate Commerce Act and Sherman Antitrust Act expanded the federal government's regulatory capabilities in the economic realm. A trend had begun to set as time went on. Federal powers only seemed to expand. This was finally cut short when, in 1895, the Supreme Court case United States versus E.C. Knight found that the federal government could not regulate manufacturing. The court argued that if manufacturing were to be under federal jurisdiction, comparatively little would be left to the states.
For a few decades, there existed a relative balance between federal and state powers as dual federalism ran its course. However, when the Great Depression hit, this all changed. A new phase of federalism, called cooperative federalism, began. Under this framework, states and the federal government worked together to solve national-level problems such as rampant unemployment and widespread poverty. The New Deal programs instituted under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt represented a huge growth in federal power as the National Labor Relations Act established the federal government as the supreme economic power in the country. Lyndon B. Johnson's administration in the 1960s further expanded upon this federal power through the passage of Medicaid, Medicare, and a variety of other educational, environmental, and social programs.
However, what goes up must go down. In the late 1960s and into the 1970s, presidents such as Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan initiated the dawn of new federalism, where some powers were returned to the states through decentralization. In the 1990s, a 60-year period of constant federal expansion in commerce was finally ended when the court case United States v. Lopez was litigated. Let's go to the thought bubble.
The Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 was a law passed under the H.W. Bush administration that banned all unauthorized individuals from carrying firearms in school zones. Alfonso Lopez was a high school a senior in Texas that carried a concealed firearm to school with him one day, which led to him being charged for violating a federal criminal statute, the Gun-Free School Zones Act. Lopez was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and 2 years supervised release. He then appealed this decision on the grounds that Congress did not have the authority to regulate guns in schools, for it did not fall under the scope of the Commerce Clause. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in Lopez's favor, limiting the powers of Congress under the Commerce Clause for the first time in decades, signifying a major shift in American federalism.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. Nowadays, federalism is far from being unimportant. The COVID-19 pandemic has necessitated strong federal action, which has been regularly challenged by the states. When President Joe Biden imposed a nationwide vaccine or testing mandate for large employers, he found himself defending his legal right to do so. The Supreme Court held a special session to consider these challenges, where it determined that the private mandate was outside of Biden's executive powers. Now, his similar mandate placed upon federal employees is facing the same challenge.
On top of federal executive powers, state legislatures have also found themselves on the hot seat when it comes to their COVID responses. For example, one of California's COVID restrictions that limited social gatherings to 3 families was struck down by the Supreme Court in Tandon v. Newsom, which determined that the law was unconstitutional due to it unfairly discriminating against at-home religious activities. As we go into the future, it is likely that the balance of federalism in the country will continue to ebb and flow. Paying attention to it allows you to know what level of government is responsible for each measure, which is policy knowledge that is absolutely imperative for well-thought-out voting and public participation.
Stay in school, don't do drugs, drink your milk, and brush your teeth, kids.
Thanks for watching.
See you around.